So I'm especially glad to be here today because you may not have a sense like I do of what an amazing occasion this is. There is no other group of psychiatrists in the world, certainly not sponsored by a reputable and very distinguished organization, that has gotten itself together to try to bring evolutionary biology to psychiatry. And I think what you are hearing today is the beginning of what will likely become the World Center for Evolution and Psychiatry. And I hope helping to save our profession from itself and having it move forward. I thought maybe I could just skip my talk. Paul presented my ideas in such exquisite, clear, accurate way, I thought maybe I'd just take the afternoon off, but there are a few other things to say. But then after I heard your talk, I thought, well, I need to add an extra hour to talk, bring in the social dimension. That'll be for some other time. The title here is the title of my forthcoming book, which I must finish by April 30th. And I've gotten lots of good ideas from you, and it's a lot of good ideas floating here that are wonderful. It's a very small part of evolution and psychiatry. Usually I've given talks about all of evolutionary medicine and all of evolutionary psychiatry, and it doesn't work. So I'm just going to talk to you about one small part of evolution. And notice what I'm saying, evolutionary psychiatry. I've pleaded with your organizers to change their name, because as soon as you call it evolutionary psychiatry, it makes it sound like it's some special alternative weirdo kind of treatment. I think what we should be saying is evolutionary foundations for psychiatry, just like there are genetic foundations and cognitive foundations. I don't know but if I slip, you'll forgive me. So our grand vision that I think we share and that's growing is that what I call a genuinely medical model for psychiatry, which strongly implies that the current model is a bogus medical model for psychiatry. I think evolution provides, as Paul said so well, for psychiatry, what physiology provides for the rest of medicine. And some people think evolution reductionism, au contraire, it's the exact opposite. We have to offer the antidote to mindless reductionism and bringing the person and the mind and the life and social relationships back into the equation in a scientific way. I begin, however, with how effective we are as psychiatrists and just how deep the problems are in our profession. This is no secret to most of you. Diagnosis, of course, is in desperate disarray. So the U.S., the very first page of Kaplan and Sadok, in the second paragraph says, there is no reason to trust these diagnostic categories. They're not based on science whatsoever. What? In our leading textbook. Massive comorbidity, no one knows really what to do about that. Huge prevalence of these disorders to the extent that, actually, Ron Kessler is a friend, and you can kind of adjust the standards so that you stay below the 50%. It seems more realistic to people if it's below 50% of the population who has a disorder. 15 years ago, we all thought, now that we had scans, that we would find brain lesions. We haven't found them. What does that mean? We also haven't found the genes that we thought we would find. I was even confident. We have not found them. And worse yet, no breakthroughs in causes or treatments. We're muddling along, doing little bits of better, and we're effective as a profession, but the foundations are very shaky, and it makes us look bad and makes our professional lives less satisfying because we do it effectively, but we don't know what it is we're doing really. I got into this in part, in fact, the whole reason evolutionary medicine exists, because I was so frustrated at the conclusion of my training. All my friends were becoming brain doctors and giving drugs and not talking to their patients, or they were not giving drugs and only talking to their patients and talking about their patients' early lives, or we got cognitive behavioral therapy going in the anxiety clinic that I helped to run for 40 years, or doing behavior therapy. But it's all fragmented, isn't it? And then we have these fights amongst ourselves, and it makes us all look kind of silly. Is there some way we can find a solid foundation that we can all stand around and talk congenially and pulling it all together? This is too long a text, right? You're not supposed to show, but this is brilliant. I'm just going to read it. A recent conference on psychiatric education, many psychiatrists seem to be saying to medicine, please take us back and we'll never again deviate from the medical model. For as one critical psychiatrist put it, psychiatry has become a hodgepodge of unscientific opinions, assorted philosophies and schools of thought, mixed metaphors, role diffusion, propaganda, and politicking for mental health and other esoteric goals. In contrast, the rest of medicine appears neat and tidy. It has a firm basis in the biological sciences, enormous technological resources at its command, and a record of astonishing achievements in elucidating mechanisms of disease and devising new treatments. It would seem that psychiatry would do well to emulate its sister medical disciplines by finally embracing, once and for all, the medical model of disease. I'm not sure how many of you recognize the source of this. This is George Engle in Science in 1961. This first paragraph, of course, did become the mantra for our field for the past 50 years. And where did it end up? Tom Insel has recently retired as a director of the National Institutes of Mental Health in the United States, and he said a few years ago, whatever we've been doing for the 5 decades, it ain't working. When I look at the numbers, number of suicides, disabilities, mortality data, it's abysmal and it's not getting any better. Maybe we just need to rethink this whole approach. With no validated biomarkers and too little in the way of novel medical treatment since 1980, it's time to rethink mental disorders. Now, he's not really serious about that. His idea of rethinking mental disorders is to look still harder for the genes and the spots in the brain. But now I take you back to what else George Engle said in 1961. He gave that first paragraph, and then he says, but I do not accept the premise that we should follow this pseudo-medical model. Rather, I contend all medicine is in crisis, and further, the medical crisis derives from the same basic fault as psychiatry's, namely adherence to a model of disease no longer adequate for the scientific tasks and social responsibilities. So this is where I was when I was frustrated, and I realized that there was no trying to bring evolution to psychiatry without actually doing it for medicine first. And we're now to that phase. And you mentioned a bit about me being in medicine as well. I confess, I've concealed my background as a psychiatrist because I wanted to be taken seriously as a physician and doing all of my work. In fact, the chapter I just finished is on evolution and cancer. And now I finally feel the time is ripe for me to come back and become a psychiatrist, evolutionist full-time. And I'm glad to join you again. Biopsychosocial model is what George Engle advocated. Everybody's advocated it. It's wonderful. We all should do it. Nobody does it. They all talk about it. No one actually does it. The medical model has proved to be much more profitable and simple, and what human minds want most is something simple. A few diseases, each with specific causes. As for evolutionary medicine, it's not a special kind of treatment. It's used in the basic science of evolutionary biology, as Paul said so clearly, to illuminate and improve medical treatment. It's the intersection of the basic science and the clinical profession. The core mystery that George Williams and I tried to promote, and it has really engaged my whole career and interested so many people, is why the body isn't better. Why do we have an appendix and a narrow birth canal and wisdom teeth and inability to control cancer and infection any better than we do? You'd think natural selection could have done better. I'm going to save you that part of an evolutionary medicine lecture. There's lots of them on the web and elsewhere. We're going to go right on specifically to emotional disorders. I would love to talk with you about schizophrenia and eating disorders and ADHD. There are good evolutionary ideas about each of these, but I'm going to limit myself today just to emotional disorders because that's half of what we do. The burden is gigantic. This is data from World Health showing that unipolar depression for women of reproductive age in modern societies is 1/3 of all medical problems in terms of disability and early death. This includes all medical problems. Then you get schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, another mood disorder, traffic accidents, mostly from alcohol, OCD, clearly emotion. 2/3 of the medical burden for women in modern societies is burden from mental disorders, and most of that is emotional disorders. Schopenhauer is the great pessimist, and I'm afraid I identify with the man. He notes that if the immediate and direct purpose of our life is not suffering, then our existence is the most ill-adapted to its purpose in the world. Doesn't it seem like that sometimes when you come back after a hard day in clinic? It's just, who designed this thing? Couldn't they have done a better job, please? And this is the question we've been asking in evolutionary medicine. Why are we vulnerable to disease? This applies to cancer and atherosclerosis and Alzheimer's disease. I also spent most of the last summer on Alzheimer's disease. I'd love to tell you about that another time. But it also applies to schizophrenia, anorexia, anxiety, and depression. Why did the system get designed in a way that's so vulnerable to these kinds of disorders? The thing my students always do and everybody does, and you must help me stop this, is people say, oh, the evolutionary benefit of cancer is. And I'll tell you that when George Williams and I first did our work, we asked each other that question for a month until we realized it's the wrong question. Natural selection does not shape diseases. If you hear somebody saying the evolutionary benefit of some disease, say stop. No, evolution does not shape diseases. Evolution shapes things that make you vulnerable to diseases, and that's very, very different. If you hear that, please stop, people. If you don't, our whole field is going to go down the drain. Tinbergen's 4 questions. I'm going to be the third person to talk about this. And I added this slide in because I had a wonderful sabbatical at UCL in 2002. I spent the entire first month staring at a brick wall and listening to the Welsh steam fitters replacing the main steam thing right beneath me, and thinking about Tinbergen's 4 questions, and I finally put them into a way that organizes them and helps me understand them. There's 2 of them that are about the mechanism, one about development within the individual, and the other about how the mechanism works in a cross-section in time. The other 2 questions are evolutionary questions. One is transition over time, phylogeny, and the other is selective advantage. And actually, I put this on the web, and within a year it was on Wikipedia, and finally I published it in Tree in honor of the centennial, or the 50th anniversary of the publication. A quick anecdote. Actually, Tinbergen published this to honor Lorenz because Lorenz was getting quite old. Lorenz was 60 years old. Doesn't seem that old to me. And of course, the other irony here is that in honoring his mentor, Tinbergen, in this single paper, its conceptual paper, really transformed and improved the whole way we think. And this is a lot of what we have to offer to our colleagues. It's several different kinds of conceptual clarifications that are as powerful as this for improving how we can think about mental disorders. We don't have a new way of treatment. There's no such thing as evolutionary psychiatry as a kind of treatment, I don't think. But there is evolutionary foundations that are missing that can help us all understand what we're doing. So the 6 reasons for vulnerability have caught on quite nicely, and they're used very widely now. These are the things that George and I came up with after working for a number of years together. Reasons why the body isn't better. The first is some things selection can't do, like start over again, and redesign something, or eliminate all mutations. 2, yes, we're in modern environments, and a lot of diseases are present now, but they were never present much before. Pathogens evolve faster than we do. The amazing thing is that we can exist at all and avoid infection. Trade-offs, nothing can be perfect. Some people say evolutionary medicine says the body's perfect. Excuse me, it says nothing can be perfect because anything can be better only at the cost of something else being worse. Reproductive success at the cost of health is one of the deepest, most disturbing things, and I have a whole separate lecture about that. Have you noticed that some of your patients do things that are not in their interests? And that very often those are sexual things? And it's not only our patients either, it's like all of us. It's fascinating actually to think about what proportion of difficulties in people's lives come from them being pushed by their genes to do things good for genes that are not actually good for their health or happiness. The last one is what we're going to focus on exclusively today, defenses. That is, these are not actually reasons for vulnerability, but they're often confused with diseases. In particular, there are 2 kinds of things physicians in general medicine distinguish almost intuitively. They're doing it better yet now that evolution's coming to bear. These are things that are just a machine not working right. Seizures, cancer, paralysis, jaundice. There's no function to those things. They just happen. They indicate something's not right in the machine. But they don't have these things, fever, cough, pain, fatigue, and anxiety. Those are mechanisms shaped by natural selection to go off when they're needed because they're useful in those situations. You can see where this is going. Emotions are not diseases, they're defenses. That is, the negative ones are. The positive emotions, you wouldn't want to call them defenses, but they're all responses shaped by natural selection because they're useful in a certain situation. And I'm calling this the fundamental mistake. In failure to recognize negative emotions as things that can be useful is such a fundamental mistake. Again, Paul said it earlier today. It's like, treating cough as the disorder. Cough isn't the disorder. Cough is a symptom of the disorder. And the emotions that we see are symptoms of bad things happening in people's lives. Diagonal psychology. Most research on evolution and mental disorder, or on mental disorders in general, has been about negative affect. Depression, anxiety, this is what people come complaining about, and has justifiably been the right focus for most research. In the last 15 years, a number of psychologists have pointed out that we're really neglecting the other half of affect. We should also be talking about the benefits of positive affect. And they've gone whole hog telling us all we should try as hard as we can to be happy right now because it's good for our health. Well, it is good, but there's something missing here, right? If you take an evolutionary view of these capacities, you notice that we should be also talking about the benefits of negative affect, at least for our genes, if not us. And we should even be talking about the costs of excessive positive affect. So for every single response in the body, whether it's emotion or cough or fever or whatever, you can have too little and you can have too much. And it's these dysregulations that form the focus of most of our work. We need diagonal psychology to address these neglected boxes. So, I think we all would recognize that emotions theory is crucial for understanding emotional disorders, but psychiatrists and psychologists have not paid much attention to emotions theory. They just go right for depression is bad, let's get rid of it. Why hasn't more attention been paid? I decided in about 1988 that if I was going to treat emotions for the rest of my life, I was going to try to understand them. So I gave myself a solid year to read everything I could find about emotions. What I found was interminable debates about what they are, how many aspects they are. Is the dimensional model better? Is the basic emotions model better? How are they regulated? Are they really innate or are they cultural? Does each emotion... I was really confused by the time I finished my 1 year of reading. What is an emotion? I love this article, 92 definitions in 1981, and that was a long time ago. Every new paper has a new definition, including mine. Then all these books. Why do we need books like what is an emotion? What is emotion? Why do I... If all these books really suggest that we're missing something if we don't even know what it is we're talking about. Here are aspects of emotions. There's so many articles about which comes first, the physiology or the thought or the motivation or the consciousness. The answer to this one is that they all influence each other in somewhat integrated states. And we really don't need to revisit the James Lange difficulty anymore. Dimensional models remain popular, and the people who advocate them on unpleasant to pleasant and mild to intense, things do fit there very nicely, and you can elaborate dimensional models. But then you have to get into a tussle with the people who have basic emotion models, and the people with basic emotion models fight amongst themselves about how many basic emotions there are and what they are. And you're not supposed to read the slide, you're just supposed to look at it and to see that every expert has a different list of basic emotions. And there's no way for figuring out which ones are the real basic emotions. Are you confused yet? I finally paused in the midst of all of this literature I'd been swimming in for a year, and I recognized that I was having emotions. They were arousing emotions in me. And the emotions were frustration and confusion, and by the end of it all, hopelessness. I decided I just wasted a year trying to understand it and given up, basically. I just couldn't get out of it anything concrete. And then finally, I went back to the master. I should have read him before. I went back to William James. And oh, William James, he was really brilliant. He says, as far as the scientific psychology of the emotions goes, I may have been surfeited by too much reading of classic works on the subject, but I should as lief read verbal descriptions of the shape of the rocks on a New Hampshire farm as toil through them again. They give one nowhere a central point of view, or deduction, or general principle. They distinguish and refine and specify in infinitum without ever getting on to another logical level. Isn't it marvelous? And it doesn't exactly solve the problem, but at least you're in good company if you feel confused. I went then to evolution approaches to emotion, and everybody told me read Darwin. He's done it, Evolution and Emotions. Or McLean's Triune Brain, or EPSIG. I'm sorry, I tried them all, and they didn't answer what I wanted answered. Finally, I found an article by Fridland about why I was dissatisfied with Darwin's work. I mean, yes, he does get credit for talking about the emotions, but he restricted himself enormously to the expression of emotions and how humans and animals are similar, instead of talking about difference amongst animals and the actual motivational and other kind of functions that's led to why natural selection shaped them. And Fridland argues quite convincingly that Darwin is anti-Darwinian in that book. MacLean's triune brain was very useful in getting people to think about emotions, at least in terms of phylogeny and different parts of the brain, but the idea that each different component of the brain has a very fixed relationship to a certain kind of thinking or emotions is not helpful all that much. Evolutionary psychologists tried very hard to argue that there's radical modularity in the brain and that emotions are separate states that are, except that's not what natural selection does. Natural selection does not make things in nice, tidy little categories with little boundaries around them. It makes something that works, but it's quite messy, actually. And finally, if you look up on Wikipedia or Google, what's the evolutionary function of anger, you'll get 6 or 10 different answers. The evolutionary function is to protect yourself against attack, to keep groups intact. The truth is that all the different emotions share and overlap different functions, and they all serve different functions. That's not a route that's going to take us forward. So now what? What do we do next? Again, I think we need to get away from this idea that it's more of an English garden, it's more of an Italian garden. It's more like a wild bank, Darwin's tangled bank. I mean, and it's not the kind of clear, crisp, simple structure that we really want. We have to accept that natural selection shapes things that are messy, that get the job done. Ed Wilson, hugely influential paragraph. I read this when I was on call one night, reading late at night. I bought the book as soon as it came out. Love joins hate, aggression, fear, expansiveness, withdrawal, and so on, and blends designed not to promote the happiness of the individual, but the favor to maximum transmission of the controlling genes. That gobsmacked me. I thought, oh my God, I've had a misunderstanding about human behavior and emotions my entire career. If you have a mutation that makes you have more children, that makes you unhappy all your life, it's going to spread. It's a very disturbing idea. I'd note that Ed took this paragraph out of his book as he's gone down the slippery slope to mistaken thinking about group selection. Don't follow him down that slope, please. So what would a real evolutionary approach to this be? It's really applying behavioral ecology, modern behavioral ecology, to the emotions. And I'm going to quickly go through my best answers to 5 questions. How do emotions increase fitness? How did different emotions evolve? How are their regulation mechanisms shaped? Why are negative emotions so often excessive? And I think they usually are excessive, which is why we can get away with treating them and not hurting people. And finally, why are so many emotions so irrational? First, how do emotions increase fitness? Individuals get an advantage if they have a special mode of operation that they go into in certain situations. It's just like sweating, shivering, and pain. These are things shaped by natural selection to respond in certain situations, and they give a selective advantage. Number 2, how did different emotions evolve? Well, they were partially differentiated from precursor emotions across phylogenetic time to cope with ever more specialized kinds of situations. And as for whether we should be thinking in dimensional terms or basic emotion terms, an evolutionary perspective makes it clear that that whole debate is really not biologically informed. What we need to look at is the situation in which each emotion is useful, and those situations overlap with each other. Some examples: sweating is a situation that evolved, or a response that evolved to cope with excess heat. Cough to foreign matter in your bronchi. Inflammation to infection. Pain to tissue damage. Anxiety to a threat of loss. Sadness to loss. Jealousy to the threat of a loss of a mate. You can see how they get more specific, but not completely separate from one another. The situations that have shaped the different emotions are those that have recurred over evolutionary time and influence fitness, so that individuals who have a capacity to enter a special state where cognition and motivation and physiology and memory and facial expression all change, they get a selective advantage. And this is a diagram that I drew that's been very helpful, republished a number of times now. all the way back to bacteria. I mean, bacteria respond to their environments. When things are really tough, they form spores. I would say that, conceptually is really quite the same as an emotional response. They also swim forwards or in random ways to get to good places. I give a whole lecture about mood in bacteria, but we're not going to do that today. But notice that right at the beginning, there's two basic circumstances that organisms face: opportunities or threats, positive emotions and negative emotions. And the real point of this is to notice that these clusters of leaves on the tree are overlapping with each other. We don't have to argue about how many basic separate emotions there are, because they're not separate. They've all come from each other in an evolutionary process that gradually differentiates them. Emotions correspond to situations, not functions, not brain loci. They're overlapping functional boundaries, and there's no distinct set of basic emotions. When people talk about this, they originally think, okay, there's a lion coming towards you. Yes, but at least for we humans, that's not the real thing that arouses emotions mostly. And I wish I had another hour to go in, Robin, to how the social, what kind of suffering do we have these days? Physical? Most people that we encounter have enough food to eat, and they're not in pain and they're not hungry. I mean, it's wonderful. The kinds of suffering they experience are social emotions. They feel jealous and angry and lonely and depressed and anxious about what other people think about them. This is right at the core of the biggest problems we face now, and we need to try to get at it. So I decided to look at it in terms of goal pursuit, because in fact pursuing goals, especially social goals like getting certain people to love us or accept us in their group or think well of us, there are two kinds of goals: opportunities and avoiding bad things. Back to that diagram I just showed you. Ahead of time, we experience hope and desire, anxiety or fear. After a success, happiness, pleasure, or relief. After a failure, disappointment, sadness, or pain. I was so proud of this, and this really helped me to understand. I started looking at my own life and my patients. You've got to figure out what a person is trying to do in life and how it's going before you can understand their emotions. And then I started asking people, this has got to be familiar, right? And most of my psychologist friends said, no. Then I talked to some older people who had read more widely and classically, and they pointed out what I should have known all the time, that this is pretty much exactly what Plato, the Stoics, Cicero, and Hume had been saying all the time, except we've forgotten it and made it all into fancy neuroscience. And this is well-known ancient stuff. Most psychiatrists aren't aware of it, and I think we need to bring this kind of basic thinking back into the picture. 3. How does selection shape the regulation mechanisms? An emotion's no good if it's there all the time. It's only good if there's a mechanism to detect whether the situation is present and express the emotion in that situation, and preferably not in other situations. How does it detect the situation? And the answer here is, again, it's messy. Natural selection works to identify these situations any way it can, with little tiny cues. This business of social attention, for instance, people not looking at you, and now we're back to Robin's work. If people just don't look at you and don't pay attention to you, that feels really bad. Probably because that stimulus has been a fairly reliable cue that there's something wrong between you and the group, or you and other people, if in fact that's what you're experiencing. It's not a specific module, it's just something that's wired in the brain that way. Next, why does motivation vary? There are people whose motivation doesn't vary. They have the exact same level of effort and interest and enthusiasm at all times. I don't think they do as well in life as people whose motivation varies depending on good times and bad times. If someone tells you, you can get a grant if you can get it in 48 hours, and we guarantee you'll get 100,000 pounds to do your research, most of us would not bother sleeping for 48 hours and do it and be quite enthusiastic all the time. Those people who couldn't generate the enthusiasm and stay up all night are not going to do as well. Mood, enthusiasm, initiative, and risk-taking increase when the payoff is high or temporary, but it decreases from a specific activity when it's not working, and from all activity when all the options available have costs that are greater than benefits. Now, this doesn't happen that often these days. Usually these days, because we have heat and electric lights and food in the refrigerator. But for our ancestors, there were many times when anything you would do would just be wasting calories because there's no food out there to get. Your best thing to do would be nothing. Picking raspberries is, I think, an exemplar to help us understand mood. It's simple, but it gets the idea across about how mood can be helpful. This is Charnoff's famous marginal value theorem. How many people are familiar with it? Only one. So this is one of the most fundamental principles regulating all behavior, and all psychiatrists, in my opinion, should spend a couple of hours with this, because this is what regulates our behavior. Animals go from patch to patch looking for food, and they have to stay at the right length of time in each patch. For now, we're going to pretend we're going from raspberry bush to raspberry bush, and it takes this much time to find a new raspberry bush. No raspberries coming in during that time. Once you find a bush, isn't it kind of exciting? You get a whole lot of raspberries right at once, and you feel excited and enthusiastic, and you get a lot of raspberries, and then you've picked most of them, and then you've picked all of them. And there comes a point when you just kind of get bored with that raspberry bush and disappointed, and you start thinking, you know what, this isn't working, I think I better look for another one. It's not just us. Every animal that forages has to have this mechanism working pretty well. And it turns out that ladybird beetles foraging for aphids follow exactly this, and they follow it very well. Not because they can do the calculus. I'll tell you the secret in just a moment. Here it is. This is my wife's way of foraging for raspberries. She thinks it's wasteful to leave a raspberry on the bush. I'm exaggerating a bit, but, and forgive me, Margaret, if you watch this. This is the number of raspberries you get and the time it takes to get them, right? So this is the slope is the number of raspberries per minute. You want that slope to be steeper, but sometimes I actually go too quickly between different raspberry bushes, being slightly ADHD and impatient. So I'm actually likely to get a lot of raspberries from one bush and then go looking for another one. So I spend most of my time looking for new bushes. She spends most of her time trying to get the last raspberry off the bush. The optimal strategy mathematically, and I'll spare you the calculus, is to take the tangent. Then you get the maximum number of berries per time that you possibly can. This is what mood initiative is for. I mean, at a certain point, working on a paper, you decide, I'm not going to make any more progress on this tonight, and you quit, and that's a good thing. There are people who work all night and waste their time. That's not good. There are people who work on their paper for 10 minutes and quit. That's no good. The right amount of time invested on everything you do. This also applies to relationships. That's a whole other story. In good times, you spend some time finding a new bush, you get a big payoff. Another time finding a bush, get a big, the longer you stay, the more calories you get. Wonderful time. These are good times. And most of people's lives these days are like this. But sometimes for some people, unfortunately, it's more like this. A long time to find a new bush, a small payoff. This is, I call this dating in New York. You know, it's really hard. So initiative in this situation just leads to wasted time and effort. When is it best to do nothing? Or at least not pursue what you're doing? When costs are greater than benefits for all available actions, it's best not to do anything. A motto for unpropitious times, don't just do something, stand there. And this is not intuitive. I mean, the idea, the cultural norm is we're all supposed to be enthusiastic and positive and doing things at all times. But I'm not sure that's right, especially for people's close personal lives, because for many times things are just not going well. And I also think this might have something quite deep to do with depression in relationships. I mean, if your spouse is mean to you for a week, you could just say, enough of this, I'm leaving. But it's probably better to stick it out for a while. And if in fact you feel low mood, like, you know what, probably nobody else would have me, that's probably good, because it keeps you from making a premature jump out to something that's probably even worse. And this brings us to the depressogenic situation. Ask yourself the question, if you wanted to make someone depressed, how would you do it? You put them trapped in pursuing an unreachable goal. And our society creates those situations for many people these days, in particular for graduate students. Because they're graduate students who have spent several years getting a degree, and at some point they realize that they're never going to get a job that uses their degree. They've already invested. Sorry, if there's any graduate students here, you may leave before this next point. But I've seen many such students. What a quandary to have invested a whole lot of life and money and interest trying to do something and realizing at the end of it all, you're probably not going to actually get the payoff that you wanted. Do you quit and drive a taxi cab? What do you do? Or it's the same in certain marriages. You've been in a marriage for a number of years and you realize it's really not working. But you've made a huge investment. You can't just leave. You can't just stay. Being trapped, pursuing an unreachable goal. It might be the unreachable goal of trying to get your mother to love you, which is a really big one for a lot of people. And that also can be equally hopeless. My first half of my career, I spent all my time with my depressed patients saying, let's figure out what you're trying to get. There's a way. Don't let your depression get in the way. We can do it together. It was so young and naive. Gradually, I started realizing that many things people want to do in life, they're not going to succeed at. And some people have taken this idea and said, oh, so we should just tell people to quit. No. What we should do is try to talk with our patients about why it is they can't quit their pursuit of an unreachable goal. And that takes, I think, deep clinical intuition and knowledge and closeness to the patient and understanding and empathy. William Blake, if any could desire what he's incapable of possessing, despair must be his eternal lot. No new ideas under the sun. This is all well known by poets and philosophers. Graduate student of mine, Matt Keller, did a wonderful study looking at whether different situations cause different symptoms in depression. And another graduate student has gone on to prove that using rating scales that take a sum score of different symptoms for depression, like the Hamilton in the back, it ignores all the actual data about the specific symptoms of depression, which are actually as closely attuned to the person's situation as our different symptoms of a cold are to whether your cold is in your nose or your throat or your lungs. Crucial question my residents ask now is there something very important you're trying to do in life you can't give up despite knowing you're unlikely to succeed? And this question has opened up the lives of so many patients to me. I'm going to go through a few things here, just talking so I have time for discussion. A very important thing is to say that this isn't the whole answer. I think about half of my patients have an unreachable goal at the center of their problem. About half don't. Some of them have unfortunate genes or toxic drugs or inflammation causing their depression. The whole idea that depression has one cause comes from this misunderstanding of thinking that emotions are diseases. They're not. They're responses that can be aroused by many different things. We need to understand them top down, how motivational structures influence the brain, and how the brain influences our thinking. This is how all organisms work. They take resources and they make offspring. Seems simple, doesn't it? But the reality is more like this. Resources, material resources, that gets really complicated. This is why we have big brains to figure out these things, and even thinking through them all night, we can't figure them out. The reality is that, actually. No wonder everything is so complicated. I propose that we need the equivalent of a review of systems, but for psychiatry. In the rest of medicine, they go through each different bodily system, and they say, is anything wrong there? We need to do the same thing with people's social lives. And I've imitated the APGAR, which is Virginia Apgar's way, as you all know, for coding a newborn baby about its health, and done the same thing for the resources, behavioral ecological resources, social resources, occupational resources, children, family, income, abilities, and love. Those are really the 6 big things that people are striving for in life. And I have a standardized inventory where we began filling it out in the clinic, and boy, did it open our eyes. We had some patients who had obsessive compulsive disorder, who had very severe illnesses, and they were taking showers for 2 hours a day and had trouble working, but they had a job and a spouse and interests and appearance, that they were functioning in life. We had other patients who had much milder syndromes, but who didn't have any income or partner or kin or occupation or social support. Completely different cases. You know these cases. They're the ones that are so hard to treat. And we shouldn't just pretend they have a more severe kind of OCD. No, they have a social system. They have a life situation that is not functional. and the complexities there. Last is why are negative emotions so common? And I'd like to emphasize that I do not believe that most negative emotions are useful. I think most of them are not useful, and it's because of how natural selection shapes the regulation mechanisms. It's the smoke detector principle, who some of you have heard before. The idea is that a normal system will express the protective response whenever the cost is less than the benefit. And if the cost is relatively low, like a smoke detector going off, it's going to go off when there's even a small chance that the danger is actually present. And to make it concrete, we imagine that you hear a noise behind a rock. Should you run away and not bother getting water for your family that night? Well, it depends. The cost of fleeing, we're going to say, is 100 calories. The cost of not fleeing, if it does turn out to be a lion behind that rock, is more like 100,000 calories, which is how many calories a lion would get if it ate you. So how loud would the noise have to be before it would be wise to flee? You should flee whenever the noise is loud enough that the probability is anything greater than 1 in 1,000, which means that 999 times out of 1,000, the panic attack experienced will be unnecessary but perfectly normal. This applies to all defenses. This applies to pain, fever, cough, nausea, and all the rest. This is why general medicine is possible without hurting people too much. Because most of these responses go off many, many times when they're not actually needed, so we can use drugs to block them. But instead of just blocking them willy-nilly, we should be teaching doctors and ourselves to think about this particular person. This is personalized medicine without the genes, trying to make good clinical decisions about when we use drugs to block a defensive response. Very applicable in panic disorder, where you can talk to patients. I used to tell them, oh, it's your brain that's doing this. It's a real psychiatric disorder. And over again, they'd say to me, but doctor, I know it's physical. Can you refer me to a good cardiologist, please? And finally, I changed my tune, and I said, what you're experiencing is a false alarm on a useful panic response that would save your life if a lion were chasing you. And they said, oh, that makes sense. Why is it a false alarm? I explained a little bit, and fully 1 out of 4 would say to me, that makes such perfect sense. I don't think I need to worry about this anymore. I don't think I need another appointment. Thank you very much. Come back if you need me. But how satisfying it is to use theoretical understanding to change what you do in the clinic in a way that has immediate tangible benefits to your patients. Lastly, why are emotions so emotional? Why do people get so irrational, especially with anger and jealousy? We see people in our clinic all the time, and they're irrational. And sometimes we try to help them be rational, which is a good idea, I think. But I think there are good evolutionary reasons why emotions should not be rational. I wrote a whole book, or edited a whole book, on the strategies of commitment, which is game theory. Nuclear mutually assured destruction is the foundation of it. Being irrational is essential to having social manipulation capacities. People who are completely objective can be easily manipulated, as many of us know. And then there's psychodynamic defenses. I've been fascinated by the psychodynamic defenses. I don't think they're there by accident. They're not just glitches in the system. We are actively unable to get in touch with some of our motives. And it's probably a good thing, because it first of all protects us from some of the things we can't have that we're striving for. And there's a whole world there of exploration of psychodynamics biologically in terms of the benefits of being unaware of some of our impulses. And here's the lecture I'll give another time. Maybe Robin and I can do it together, about all of the social emotion disorders, a whole other realm combining what I've just said with trying to understand how relationships work and the specialized emotions that get aroused in relationships. And then there are the neglected emotional disorders. Why do anxiety and depression get all of the interest? Why not all the disorders of too much anger or too little anger, or too much love or too little, or too much jealousy or too little? Envy even is useful. Some people don't have enough of it to take benefits. Other people have way too much, and it makes them and everybody around them miserable. So, practical bottom line for every clinician: if you see an emotion, and we see them all the time, what should you do? Should you try to kill it off the way so many doctors do? No. I mean, that was our attitude towards bacteria. They're all bad, kill them off. Turns out we have a microbiome, and we should recognize that those microbes are useful. Likewise for emotions, when you see an emotion, you should first of all think like a doctor and try to figure out what might be arousing this emotion. And then you take it to the second stage and say, is this emotion excessive given this circumstance for this person? And then you make a separate decision about how to relieve suffering irrespective in a thoughtful way. But instead of just willy-nilly blocking the emotion and saying it's a depressive disorder, you try to understand that person's life situation and trying to fix the situation if you can. Not very often you can, or the person would have done it. Trying to change the view of the situation, and cognitive therapy works very well, and changing the brain mechanisms if necessary, and using all of your therapeutic skills to try to help that individual. So the goal here is to try to bridge the gap between evolution and psychiatry. A couple of websites that might be helpful, and I'd like to invite you all to the big Evolution and Medicine meeting in the Netherlands, August 2017. We're open for abstracts quite soon, and a number of you here I think would offer presentations that everybody would be very interested in. Thanks very much.
Okay, so Professor Nesse, occasionally somebody presents an incredibly complex subject in such a way that it all makes sense in about 45 minutes, and that induces a sense of mild euphoria for many of us. I think you probably just managed to do that. Okay, so there's a thicket of raspberries out there, I guess. I imagine there are some questions. I think there's a furry microphone here. The furry microphone here.
Thank you very much indeed for your presentation. Just three brief comments.
So, introduce yourself.
John Alderdice, psychiatrist who's involved in applying psychological ideas to communal conflicts in various parts of the world. The first thing that you did was point us back to the things that get forgotten about and the people who have said some of the things that we've only to rediscover. William James and back as far as Plato. I mentioned two names. One from this city, Hewlings Jackson, who's hugely important in understanding not just neurology, but in his Croonian lectures pointing towards mentation and even societal developments. And the other is Henri E. Somebody earlier on mentioned that there were no...
Say the name again, please.
Henri E. E-Y. And somebody mentioned earlier on that there were no journals on evolutionary psychiatry. For decades, there has been a journal in France called Evolution Psychiatrique, which was promoted by Malinowski and Henri E. And their developments, particularly his development of organodynamic psychiatry, is a very interesting development. It doesn't answer everything, but it's an interesting contribution to thought. One of the things that he pointed out, and is rather important for us, is the development of our capacity to reflect on things and reflect on ourselves. We're not just emotions or behavior or cognition. We have a capacity for imagination, and that's one of the things that becomes disturbed whenever we become disturbed psychologically. And the third thing is that evolution is not only about natural selection. That's a very important part of the notion of evolution, but evolution is more than simply natural selection, and I just wanted to flag that up. Thanks.
So I'll just come in the last part. Absolutely that there's drift and there's migration and mutation, the other three components of evolution, and we should pay close attention to them. Again, I think one of the things that's been most thrilling to me being here today, and I've been reading the EPSIG newsletter. I hope everybody read the article. What was the title of the article about trying to do it right? Trying to avoid mistakes.
I remember that. It's Just So Stories.
It's Just So Stories or something like that. I mean, the great danger for this whole enterprise is that people are going to take it and run with it and say, oh, I've got a new kind of therapy, or they're going to use wrong ideas, because there's a lot in evolutionary theory that's quite subtle, actually. And I think here we have a really solid, good start in a critical approach to this application of theory. And it's going to be incumbent on those of you who are organizing this group to keep trying to be inclusive and bringing people in, but also encouraging a continual critical thinking about the proposals people make. And that will, in the slightest hint of weirdness, and other psychiatrists are going to say they don't want anything to do with this. They've had enough weird things already. They're already embarrassed of being psychiatrists. So I think I'm very encouraged by that direction from this group.
Can I just add to that Riyadh, Annie and myself have put together some articles, a group of 3, trying to explain some of these issues, and Sorry, I've just got a mental block of what we used as the titles now. But 2 of them are out and the 3rd one's coming. And
Could you please put them on the web, otherwise they don't really exist?
I wouldn't know how to. I'm afraid I'm still sort of
If they're
slightly
open access,
Luddite.
I'll make
The
it happen.
newsletter is on the web. It's on our pages.
So we'll talk later to make sure that
Yeah,
happens.
yeah.
But there should be some way so all psychiatrists interested can take advantage of the work that you all are developing.
And the point is, we come from a scientific angle, but not only science. And the other thing is to mention that not only science is the cultural evolution, the dual inheritance that we find important, and it's partly, we don't want to be left just discussing genes, that there are other things in culture which are equally important to look at how they've moved. And some of this is with the work of Richard Dawkins and so on in memes, although I think there's a lot of controversy about that. But it's in that area that we also have to look at evolution and how things have changed over the last, 10,000 years or whatever.
So just to amplify that, one of the reasons I moved to Arizona State is because 2 wonderful scientists and friends, Rob Boyd and Joan Silk, are there. And Rob in particular has done a wonderful job of developing what's called cultural group selection. Group selection does work at the level of culture, and it's very important to try to be thinking in these ways about how cultures evolve and don't evolve as a guide to trying to understand our human behavior in societies. Vast differences in different cultures, but everything from grief to anxiety to jealousy, and we can't just pretending that they're rigid systems. They're profoundly influenced by culture. This is not in opposition to that in any way.
I'm Annie Swanepoel. I'm a child psychiatrist. What I find most useful with having an evolutionary perspective for psychiatry is that it brings ethical questions to the fore. For example, if I see a child who is depressed and I explore the family situation and it's because they're being emotionally abused by their parents, but it doesn't reach the children's services threshold because it needs to be quite severe, especially nowadays with the austerity cuts. It means that children's services won't intervene, they'll just close the case. But we're stuck with the child being in the home where they are being exposed to constant criticism and they're depressed. And that brings up the question as a psychiatrist, what do we do? Do we treat with antidepressants in order to help the individual withstand the situation they're in when we're unable to change the situation? And I think there are many such situations, that, especially in child psychiatry. And I think the evolutionary view is helpful to make us think about, do we adapt the individual to fit into the environment, or do we adapt the environment to suit the individual?
So there are so many really good studies that you think of when you think from an evolutionary point of view that you never thought of otherwise. You never, ever, in my opinion, use your evolutionary theory to do something clinically all by yourself. You try to think up the study you need to do to give clinical evidence for clinical recommendations. In this case, I think both for those kids and for abused women who are depressed, I want to see the study. You could take women in a shelter and give half of them antidepressants and half of them not, and see how antidepressants actually work. Do they actually help the women to accept the situation and go back and not feel so bad about being abused? Or does it give them a certain kind of courage and something else to get out of that situation? I don't know the answer. I do think in terms of thinking how antidepressants work, an evolutionary view gives us a different perspective. Instead of normalizing some hormones in the brain, it's much more the way aspirin works on pain. It disrupts the system that ordinarily regulates low mood and makes it so it isn't cranking up the low mood the way it was so much anymore. A very different perspective on what these drugs are doing, a perspective that might help us to find new and better drugs, because it's good to block pain and depression. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Carol Longhitano. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist, and I'm fascinated by this day today. And I guess my question to you is, in order to link up violence with mental disorder and evolution, I think a good place to start is anger, and emotion anger, or even rage. What are your thoughts on that?
It's fascinating to me that people who don't get angry lose a lot of social influence. And people who do get angry, it's very much, it's a game theory thing, you know. If someone's so angry you don't know if they're going to kill you or not, they have a lot of influence. It's senseless for them to kill you. It's just not worth it. But if you're worried that they might, that means that you really have to treat them very differently than you would otherwise. And that kind of emotional influence is very powerful. And again, some of our patients don't have access to that. In particular, our neurotic patients fear that they will be left alone and no one else will have them. So they don't dare get angry in their relationship with their partner. And because of not being able to signal via anger, what anger really signals is, you better straighten out or I'm out of this relationship. I mean, that's what it really signals at a certain level. But if you don't dare leave your relationship ever, then you can't signal the anger. I mean, all this stuff about the relationship of anger to depression, it starts to make sense once you put it in this kind of context with evolutionary game theory. And there's a whole world to be developed there still.
Randy, I'm really sorry. Forgive me. I think we're going to have to stop the flow of the conversation, which is a real shame. Just two little observations, if I may, just really, really briefly. One thought I've got is that as a clinician, as a psychiatrist, when I see patients with severe depression, then what people invariably say is that there's something qualitatively quite different about their emotional experience of depression compared to normal sadness. And that's one thought about, you know, what's going on at that you know, the juncture between the two. And another thought is, when we give patients SSRIs in particular, they'll frequently say, well, you know, what's happened is I've lost that intensity of depression, and actually what I've got is not much feeling at all, but hey, you know, I'll buy that because I can kind of cope like this, but presumably living in a sort of hypo-emotional state, in some senses, you know, works for that individual. So there are a lot of wheels within wheels here, aren't there?
And there are, and a large question, I mean, some of our patients are hyper-emotional, and we should also attend that some are hypo-emotional, and there are advantages and disadvantages to both of those, and much more to be studied there.
Randy,
Thanks,
thank
everybody.
you so much. Thank you. Yeah.